Let me introduce our panelists. I'm sure you're familiar with these guys already because they've done some pretty cool things during the conference. But starting on the left, Wojtek Borkut, Jonathan Berger, Amber Case, and Courtney Hemphill. And we're going to be talking about how designers and programmers never talk and never work together ever, like properly. It's just not a thing that happens, right? No, we're actually going to try and figure out how to cross the divide, because there is a divide, obviously. I mean, we all know this. My own background is actually on the design side, and the tech side has only been a relatively recent addition. Recent being something like 15 years, but that's still recent. We're more or less the same vintage here, Wojtek, I reckon. So for us, 15 years is a fairly recent sort of a thing. We were sitting in the speakers lounge a couple of hours ago, and it became quite evident that people at this conference like to get stuck straight into details. So that's fine. We'll be getting stuck into details, but my job is partly to draw the discussion back towards the top level, because what I'm personally interested in is more the reasons why we work together, or not necessarily work together so well, and what we could do about it. And then we'll also ping some thoughts towards the detail quadrant. Amber, you were starting with, if I may begin with you, you were starting to tell us some particularly interesting stories. I mean, it's always good to draw on stories because we can, relate to these things. And it appears that there was a company you worked at which had a thing which was called the graphics department, and you're not old enough to have worked at that company 30 years ago.
Yeah, okay, so is this working? Okay. So I had this small startup called Geoloki. We did location technology for developers. And I strove to learn at least enough of the code of the developers, what they were working with, so that I, as a user experience designer, could understand what I was requesting people to do. So we were always in the same room. It was just this very nice kind of relationship that we're all in. But when we got bought by Esri, we found ourselves in a situation where there was this very large mapping company that had been around since 1969, and they had a graphics department. So if you wanted a graphic, as in any of the things that you might call user experience, or pretty much anything that's designed in any way, you would go to graphics@esri.com and send them a message, and some random person would get assigned that who you'd never met before. You didn't know their name before then. They could be a high-level person or an intern, and they would give you something back, right? So people would go to them for PowerPoints, or they would go to them for, hey, we finished our mobile app, can you give us some graphics? And when I found that out, I had almost these horrible heart seizure things. This was kind of across the board. Of course, we also encountered people using Dreamweaver and Cold Fusion, and I almost got in a bar fight over that. So we were trying to figure out, can we decouple all this stuff? And I said, we need to have designers on every team of development, and we need to have them embedded in the process from day one. And there wasn't the concept of a designer. There was just a concept of a graphics person. And they wanted to have the designers on our team who were designer developers. They said, well, we'll just put them in the graphics department. And I fought like tooth and nail.
This sort of stratified, legacy management style thinking persists even today.
Right, because it's the idea that you are a particular thing, you cannot be anything else, and you are in a specific building, and as a company grows, you have divisions, right? You don't have everything in the same room, and you don't have these really small teams. So I went through and I found all these people that were secretly meeting about user experience during lunch. And it was 5 people, and then it started to get to 30 people, and then 100 people, and then after a while, they started getting kind of moved up in the organization. And then we had this thing called user experience.
Did they get found out? I mean, did the cabal get like busted one day? And
no, they didn't get busted. Yeah, I tried to do this thing called like positive rumor spreading, where I didn't say this person's really great. I said, if you work with this person, your project will be likely to succeed. And then spread it around, and then tried to get them leveled up just a little bit. And over the course of a really long time, we got the graphics department destroyed. And now it's just part of kind of development. Same with marketing. Everything got folded into each other. So now, you educate the market through marketing, right? But you have to understand enough of the technology and the design and the purpose. And the developers and the designers are doing wireframes first and developing alongside each other and kind of respecting each other, right? So, and I'm not saying that it's perfect, because it's not, and I didn't have an entire hand in it, but I really wanted to bring out these graphics people that were forced to put an interface on something that they'd never seen before.
No, design is not pretty things, right? Design is...
It's how it works.
Providing elegant solutions to complex problems. Wojtek, from a fairly large company perspective that's going through personal changes, are you seeing the sort of process where the two worlds are coming closer and becoming somewhat integrated at Allegro?
I think that process has more than a single dimension. So yes, Allegro does look like it follows the footsteps of others before it, this departmentization and having the separate design or UX nowadays department rather than embedding those people directly in the teams is a problem, and we are trying to change that right now.
What sort of mechanisms? I mean, can you talk about some of the other like tools you're using, mechanisms, team management aspects of?
Well, this is mostly about team management, right? Mm-hmm. The placement of the design organization closely to user experience researchers is a thing of the past in other companies, but it still existed when I joined Allegro, right? Mm-hmm. People are trying to understand user behavior in front of the application just by the rather random observations, mm-hmm. right? If you have a sample size of 3, you are not really likely to draw the conclusions which are meaningful for the wider scale. So rather than doing that, we are now trying to work very closely with the designers. Essentially, the most recent movement is the veto power and including the approval of the UX person in the definition of done for every single mm-hmm. Scrum team. So essentially, we don't launch without the okay from, especially on the mobile, from the UX person. It is happening.
So it's come a full circle.
Well, it's come a full circle. Just I would rather see that as a pendulum, right? Mm-hmm. It was swung to one end, and now we are trying deliberately, exaggerating for effect, to find the position of balance, right? By deliberately swinging the pendulum to the other wall.
Would you guys? I mean, this is a question to all of you. Would you guys think that there may be a golden ratio of designers to developers in relation to the type of work that you're doing, to the size of company? Is there such a thing? I mean, what's been your experience?
Are you asking if we can cut designers into golden ratio sized pieces?
Yes, 1.63 something, isn't it?
I think there's a little bit of a fallacy in the notion that only designers do design and only developers do engineering. Mm-hmm. It turns out that many developers have very good ideas about design, mm-hmm. and many designers or product managers will be able to look maybe not at the syntax of a code base that they don't understand or a language they don't understand, but at the flows that are going on. And so I think one of the most crucial things you can do on a team is start to divorce people from this identity claim, this existential claim, I am a developer, or I am a designer, and start recasting it in terms of I'm a person, my primary job and my primary literacy is in development, but I also have things to contribute in these other domains. And hey, I'm curious about this. I'm not fluent at all. My development literacy or my design literacy is very low. Can you, high literacy person, tell me why you made that idea? And that helps to let teams externalize their thought processes and decision-making processes in such a way that you don't have a single person who kind of runs with the ball so far that nobody knows where they ended up. It forces conversation among the team, so the work that gets done becomes not designed by committee, but verified design and verified decisions and verified development that is a group effort and enjoys the benefits of multiple points of view rather than just one person's.
Courtney, you wanted to?
Yeah, I guess it's for us. It's not necessarily a single person ratio to a group of people. It seems more a little bit of a time ratio. I think that there's actually a lot of advantage to have multiple designers early on in a problem-solving process, or when you've got greenfield development happening, design happening, and then over time you recognize that lots of contribution is happening on design. Perhaps like you start to scale down the ratio of design concentration towards implementation, and then you might scale up design later on in the process. So for us, it's sort of to your point, it's less kind of this distinct approach at any one project. It's like over time you'll see ratios needing to kind of flex towards product needs and user
And there is no handing over. Handing over is a thing of the past, right?
Right. And I think this is actually the really hard thing when you have scaling companies that are scaling up, right? Because you sort of are like, when do we need a resource? When do we need to hire on people? How do we allocate these people? These are all questions where when you're coming from a management perspective, you're like, I need to know this because I have to plan out budgets. So it's very hard to be like, hey, just be flexible about it. Don't worry about it. This is sort of a tough thing. And so you have to kind of distribute, team, allocate it, make sure that you're pairing and flexing a little bit as best as you can.
So
That's a place, I'm sorry to jump in. That's a place, though, where the multidisciplinary actors can really help, right? If you've got a designer who's strong on front-end engineering, they can do that design phase when it's design-heavy, and then drop more into the implementation for that part of the project.
Wojtek, you were...
Yeah, well, essentially, this confirms my experiences, not from Allegro. I'm just not long enough there, but from my previous company, where there were really, really great engineers who had a lot to say about the design, and actually they can make that move very freely. And other than that, the designers were scarce resource, and usually there were teams were queuing on them, right?
How important do you think it is for the let's call the people in this room the creatives, and to use the 80s, advertising terminology, the creatives in the suits, right? So how important is it for these people here to expand the bubble of their approach, and everything being permanent beta and nothing ever being done because this is never going to get done, and explain this to the management and say, well, actually, it's your job, guys, to make sure that forecasts and budgets and all that stuff actually work in relation to what we're doing, as opposed to, kind of the other way. How much of it is a question of organizational culture?
I think the really, really good designers, the design leaders, can talk to product people, marketing people, sales people. They can communicate really well, right? Because part of design is communicating, here is an interface and here's how to use it, and also here's what we need to do first and here's what we need to do next. So I try to look for people that when you throw them into a room, things get simpler and not more difficult. So they're just asking all the questions, why do we need this thing to be here? Why do we need this thing? And then if there's a bunch of executives in a room, say 30 of them, and they're all trying to make it more complex, they can actually negotiate and compromise with them. We had some tricks. There was this development manager that kept we were trying to make a developer site, and he kept trying to put all this complexity on the front page. So we gave him a page. We said, this is your page, you can do whatever you want with it. And so we had him put all the stuff in that page, we implemented it, right? And then we did analytics, and it showed that no one went to that page. And so we could say, well, quantitatively, no one goes to this page, so we're gonna delete it. And by that time, it was okay. So it was basically this design manager was figuring out, how do I get the stakeholders here, and how do I make a trick that allows everybody to be happy so that we can get the thing that we need to get done through. And there's a lot of communication that had to happen for that. And that's the thing that's really hard for a lot of people to do. They're, a really, really good design manager makes it so that they're absorbing a lot of that chaos from the upper level management that doesn't necessarily have a concise vision, kind of sets the vision and then runs in front of all of the developers and designers that they're working with, so that they don't have to deal with all of the management themselves, right? So that they're just basically amplifying the things that the rest of the team is good at, so that they just don't have to freak out.
So having an interface person is very, if you have a team that's large enough.
Yeah.
How do these people arrive on the scene? Do they just naturally bubble up and say, actually, by my actions, I will be known, or do you go out and hire them? How do you find a person like that?
So within a large organization, I went out and just surfed the organization, started going into meetings and started to find people who were passionate. And often you'd find these really passionate people who were really correct, and they were representing the outside world, but their language that they used was very intense, right? So there's this one guy who was a developer advocate, really incredible guy, but he kept getting kind of knocked down by management because of the words that he used. He'd say, our software isn't very good, and da-da-da-da, which the management took as a direct insult, and so did development teams. So we took him, and we said, you have great ideas, and we put a translator who was politically savvy in the middle, translated and put it up to the management level, and then translated all the way back, and then he got to do what he was doing best. This other guy, got to push all this stuff forward, and that took, that would take like a whole year to set up that process. But at the end, we got to change pieces that we needed to change and represent the audience. So it's about finding those like passionate people and finding out, can we train them to speak the language that isn't hurting people's feelings? And if we can, great, we can level them up. But if we can't, then we need to run interference again.
So the translation problem is not really so much a question of designer to developer, but designer and developer to the rest of the world, starting with the rest of the organization.
I find there's often a communication divide between people who make things every day and people who don't, and making sure there's a translation layer. I think Paul Graham writes about it in terms of maker time, manager time, and a lot of people who make things creatives, right? Designers or developers who come to the level where they become managers now find the struggle of, what do I do with my day? How do I manage both the I need to go deep and get focused and write code versus I need to keep checking my email? So Paul Graham suggests you set Tuesday and Thursday as manager day, and Monday, Wednesday, or whatever, find a system. But that feels like the seam where you can start to address it.
I would also say there's, I think it's really amazing that you did this, because oftentimes people are given a moniker, a role, a title, what have you, and sort of assigned places. And it becomes very psychologically difficult to allow yourself to extend beyond that, particularly in larger organizations where there's a very clear structure. Knowing that people, this actually happened at Carbon 5. I remember there was someone there who was just really friggin' smart. She was a developer, but she also was amazing at what she called distilling. And she was that person that could go into a conversation, sit back and listen, and then just gather it all up and make this one very declarative statement that everyone's like, yes. And that was a skill, and that was something that there was no role title or anything associated to it, but we sort of saw her in this position where when a project needed that person, we could ask her to sort of play that part for a while on that project. And I think for her, it made her understand big D, design, is sort of a difficult concept, and design is a lot of different things, and you can call yourself a designer or a developer, it doesn't really matter. You have a skill knowing where you can apply that, and then ideally, having a management structure where they can see these things and allocate as necessary, or even not allocate, but just sort of bring it up. This person's really good at this thing, let's bring them in.
Yeah. There's also a situation where it works to your advantage not to have the title, right? I often found myself on projects where design was a problem, so they sent me in as the designer. But the problem wasn't design, the problem was product. The team didn't really have a good articulation of what they were building. And if I'd come in as the product owner or the product advisor, said, hey, product person, you're doing a bad job, that would have been a very kind of conflict-oriented, antagonistic relationship. But because I came in under the pretext of design, it was this Trojan horse. You just say, oh, cool, let's work together on this. Oh, wait, so why are we doing this? And by being able to kind of come in sidelong instead of directly, the wrong title provided the opportunity to do the right work.
So really, as ever, psychology is 90% of success, right?
Well, come on, it was supposed to be a discussion of designers and developers, and you are discussing corporate politics, right? How to do things.
Like we said, psychology, right?
You were touching on really two good points. It's down to the person, right? In that role, the distiller. It can be, it necessarily has to be a creative person with the authority to speak openly, and it can be either, right? And the other thing is that we are getting again down to, I'll get back to how I managed that organizationally before. Namely, there were no titles and no assigned roles. The role was assigned for the duration of the project. So people were pretty high-level managers just because we started growing like crazy for one project, and they were just individual contributor on the next one. And after 3 rotations like this, nobody cared about the titles or the roles. They were trying to do the best, to be the best at what they were trying to do. With the flexibility of the changing of the projects, it worked really, really well, up to a certain scale. That's one thing. And the other one is just the good thing for most of the people here in the audience is that in Poland, the directness in the work environment can be pretty high compared to other companies I worked for. So people take direct feedback pretty well. You don't have to run that much of the politics to get your point across.
Lucky you.
It seems that we're every day we're defining new areas of that map where it says the unknown, in that territory. I mean, job descriptions are going out the window by the sound of it. But really the underlying theme, if you think about it, is fear of the unknown, right? So our job somehow needs to be to allay those fears on the plane of relating developers to designers and other creative people, and then somehow going a couple of steps beyond that and allaying those fears within the structure as a whole. How do you do it?
I think of.
Do you have a success story? Do you have a dreadful failure story?
Well,
let's have either.
I see this all the time where you've got there's this big transition from industrial revolution to information revolution, right? So you have maybe a generation of people that are used to, hey, I have this career for life where I can train for this and I can know with some certainty that I have some skills. And then in the information society, you have complete unknowns and you're breaking new ground all the time. And the difference between how you can approach it is some people say, oh, I'm really excited about uncertainty. That's what a kid does, right? Oh, what does this do, right? Oh, how do I do this thing? Oh, what if it could do this, right? What if this could happen, right? Whereas if you act out of fear, then it's about, well, we can't do that, or let's only do the thing that we see that works, right? And there's a conservative model that you can do, which is we're going to design in a way that it's worked before by looking at use cases and case studies and interfaces that work and popular applications, and we're going to get design patterns from them, and then we're going to make those like that. Or there's okay, we're going to do that, but then there's some unknowns, so let's be excited about it.
Well, there is no safe, right? There is no safe anymore.
Right.
So I mean, we know this. How do we actually explain it to people who make financial decisions on our behalf?
I'd push back against that a little bit. I wouldn't say there's no safe. I think that the flip side of fear is curiosity, which is what Amber was describing. And I think that if you can foster an environment where failing small and quick and safe is more acceptable socially.
That's the new safe. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right? Uncertain is the new safe. Yeah. Kind of,
I think it can be dangerous to be so locked into safety. Like there's a very large company that makes software operating systems for like most computers in the 90s, right? Mm-hmm. And they had their lunch eaten by a younger company which makes search software but also makes office software, right? And all of a sudden this older company, they couldn't keep up with the office software. And I heard a story about a team, I think it was about a dozen developers working for 3 months to refactor a 200,000 line method in their flagship word processing software. How do you get to a place where you have a 200,000 line method, right? You get there because it's an environment where you can't fail, so you try not to touch any other part of the code base, and it leads to trouble. So I think the answer is by breaking problems into smaller pieces, you're compartmentalizing failure, and it makes it safer to experiment with things and exhibit and explore curiosity.
But that can only really work when, seeing as the theme of the panel is cooperation, that can only really work or it works best when there is understanding of where we're going and a full alignment, and the developers and the designers are working not just together, but actually kind of like this, right?
You need trust.
Yeah. Do we have any disaster stories? Because I love disaster stories.
Those are the fun ones.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, you know, who disagrees that we actually learn 10 times as much from our disasters as we learn from our successes, whatever those might be? You know?
Before we jump to that, I kind of disagree, right? You are trying to say Industrial Revolution was different than the information one. I do believe that it was exactly the same. Creative people in all ages worked at the edge of the unknown, right? You are just having different unknowns now than you had then. There's a beautiful movie on the YouTube where some guys in Canada built a really huge steam engine. A lot of creativity and a lot of stuff which we discuss here, relation in the work environment. You would think that the 19th century factory would be really hierarchical and related to the order and executing on the no. Not at all. The people who built that were creative, but it was different time and different scope of their work, right? And they worked together, and they respected each other for what they could do, both on the execution, as well as on the design of things. It was amazing. That steam engine didn't exist before, right? So it's clearly working on the edge of the unknown.
But they had slower unknowns.
That's for sure. We are successful in the fact that we can fail faster, and that's very, very important. Ability to fail fast, to design your processes, if you allow, in such a way that you know the outcome early.
So the danger with, okay, so you have these people making this new factory type model, and it's super creative, and then you have, okay, this is the way it's done. You know, 10 years later, now it's, okay, this is the roles, and we're going to do this model again and again, and then all the creative gets out, and then people are, you know, on the other edges, right? So we have right now in a lot of software this kind of divide of, this is the model that we use because it's worked, and then the people on the edges keep getting, you know, run into, right?
Forever. I can bet you that in 10 years there will be known methods of making software, and it will be not as cool as it is now. And there will be new creative lands for people who will supersede us, right? And the software will be like the tap water, right? It was great engineering one day to get the tap water into the large cities. Sewage, for that matter.
Yeah, in America, just the other day, the FCC is recommending classifying the internet as a public utility, just like water.
So it will happen for sure, and the creativity will be there.
Just 1 second, guys. We do welcome, you know, comments and questions and such things. If you using the appropriate piece of technology, point the questions there. There is a lady out the back who is going to receive the fax, and she will print it out and bring it to me, and it will magically appear on this table. So anytime.
I think just one thing I want to bring up, and this is sort of in line with kind of the desire for wanting to hear about failure. I think that there are large corporations in existence right now that every single day are doing the one thing that we are saying, don't do that. It's incredibly difficult to change culture at an organization once it's been in existence for, 60 plus years. And I constantly am at conferences like this talking about, lean startup and agile, and it's amazing and it's great. And people are like, can you please tell me how I make this work at my company in my team of 250? And this is hard. I think that it's amazingly slow to change given the fact that the pace of technology is 10,000 times as fast, but we are humans. We do very much align to a culture, and we very much sort of can cow to a culture that we come into. I think it's absolutely very important that people that are in managerial roles, they understand that they need to allow flexibility in their workforce, and then they also need to understand that, frankly, their job is just to provide freedom and flexibility to the one most valuable resource that they have, which is the people that are implementing things. So if companies can start to understand that, there's customers, but the people that are able to help those customers are not the top tier, it's not the process, it's not the people at management, it is literally the people that are implementing, develop, and design. They can start to understand that and give more freedom to those people. They're going to find that they are going to be capable of keeping up with the pace of technology. But at the moment, they're afraid, and it's a financial constraint as well as a cultural constraint.
And then the cliff comes and it's too late.
Yeah.
But this is not quite the discussion that we're going to have. I do want to hear the disaster stories because, I mean, really, come on. Let's. I mean, not so much the stories, but I mean, from your experiences of working, of having or working within design development teams, what have been the takeaways of stuff that actually makes things easier, makes things smoother, where the steps, somehow get smaller, and you don't spend so much time fixing stuff. When we were talking about having the conversation at the head of a project, and so many people think, oh, you're just bloody spending so much time talking. What a lot of shit. And the importance of actually, mulling through what it is that you're trying to achieve. The main takeaways, I mean, anything?
I have a disaster story.
Excellent, excellent. You want to hear it?
Okay.
Yay.
All right, so during the startup, we hired this guy from a really nice Ivy League school, and he showed up in a suit at our door, and we were running out of our apartment, and, we hadn't showered in a couple days, and it was pretty lousy, 500 square feet or something. And he knocks on the door and he's like, "Is this Geoloki?" And we're like, "Hi, how's it going?" And he's like, I thought you guys were a venture-backed startup, and and we're like, "No."
And where's my car?
Right? Where's my 30-inch monitor? He actually asked that. Yeah. And what he wanted to do was work in the theoretical programming language and make a perfect piece of software that would handle all of our issues. Number one red flag, right? Because if a software is perfect, it means no one has used it. Right? It hasn't been developed with nature. It's okay if something is not particularly good as long as you get it out there and you. So he said, well, all you have to do is give me 3 months and I'll go off and I'll work on it and then I'll come back. And I was like,
I'm brilliant.
Well, he was. Yeah. He was great. But so I said, no, we need to build this Android app. Can you learn Java? And he's like, I want to write it in OCaml. And we're like, that's great, but then we'll have to hire somebody else that knows that language. And how about this? You work for 3-4 months. I give you a recommendation at this firm called Galois that you can do really well. And he's like, great. So he writes it, and then, we have to, he keeps wanting to do this thing, right? So I thought I'd learned my lesson, right? And so I hire somebody else, and he says, well, I just need to go off and do a version 2.0 of this API. And so I just need like 3 months. So this time I said, yeah. Go off on your own, not talking to anybody else, and redesign something. 3 months later, 4 months later, I'm almost done. 6 months later, 7 months later, 8 months later, right? This is horrible. And finally, we say, can we look at your code? And he's like, no. Number 2 red flag. So we finally were like, after the acquisition, we're like, you got to go and do this other stuff, and we kind of extricate him from the company. And we finally got to look at the code, and immediately a team of 5 people said they're going to put the code on a diet, as in it had been so bulked out without having any users on it, and all these testing frameworks and methods, and it was, just this giant thing that we ended up having to rewrite the entire thing. And that was because we didn't have designers and developers and everybody in the room together, and we let somebody at a 6-person company go off and do something by themselves without any interaction. And I feel bad about it, but I learned, and
so if you're managing these 2 groups of people, the idea is to kind of enforce interaction. And if you're one of those people in one of these groups, or maybe a foot in each camp, is to be open to interaction.
Yeah, because when he was working with our designer, they were just amazing. They were just this great small team where it's, okay, let's do this thing, and they went back and forth, and
surprisingly, this can be, I've seen it a few times. It can be something of a revelation. I have to talk to people.
And some people don't. So often I said, I want to hire 2 of every kind of person. So if we have an Android developer, I want a outgoing Android developer and a non-outgoing Android developer. The outgoing developer can say, here's what we're working on to me, and the non-outgoing one can just write code because that's what they really want to do. And they can both symbiotically work with each other, right? So I started hiring people in pairs because of that. I said, I don't want to have to force somebody that doesn't want to talk. And neither do I want to have to, so you get this kind of thing going where you also have redundancy. If somebody's sick, you're not doomed, right? And they both learn from each other. You know, the outgoing one might not be heads down coding as much, so they're learning how to code better. You know, and then the other one learns a little bit about how to speak more and be a little more comfortable.
You're describing really all the benefits of pairing. Did you have them explicitly pair with each other, or they were just kind of compadres?
People ended up sitting really close to each other a lot. And people would like move around their computers, and you just see people working with each other. We ended up hiring people. We would take them to a hackathon and have them build some hackathon app with our software for fun. And then we asked them like, hey, do you want to work on an evening on an app and like finish it off? And if they wanted to, that was cool. It showed that they cared about something for more than 3 days, which is hard to find in Portland, Oregon, because. And then we said, can we pay you a little bit on the weekends? You know, and then the idea was, do you like doing this better than your day job? And if you do, then we'll just offer you a job. But by the time we offered them the job, they already knew our platform, they cared about it, and it was like their passionate side project that they got to do full time. And so we'd already kind of worked together a lot in the same room. We also had lots of monitors everywhere, so we could actually, if somebody wrote a script, we'd see it running on the server.
You got the 30-inch monitor for the guy?
No.
Amber touched on an interesting point of the physical space. And, you know, so many companies go to town, hire interior designers, and have lots of glass and expensive chairs whose name I can't even recall. Starts with A. Somebody will know, right? Those, you know,
Aeron chairs.
That's it. Yeah, $1,000 a pop or something ridiculous. But that's kind of not where it's at, right? I mean, the idea is to maybe allow people to mold their own space. How important is that in terms of, you know, getting the personal dynamic right?
We got a used office that had cubicles, and we tore them down with our own hands and threw them into a dumpster and built our own ridiculously weird spaces. And then when we moved into the really nice space where everything's set up, like there's a difference. Like Richard Feynman, the physicist, talks about this story where he was at MIT, he was trying to use the nuclear reactor as an undergrad, and it was really clean and perfect. And like no research was coming out of it. And then all the research came out of Princeton University. So he went up there to get like a PhD or whatever, and it was a mess. The nuclear reactor was just like super messy, awful, right? But all the research was coming out of it. And, you know, in the times in which we were working around the dining room table in our home, or we were like working at our crappy, you know, secondhand office with like our own furniture from home, we got so much more done then because it was unofficial space.
You can find, I forget whether it's Princeton or MIT, but there was this famous building that was
MIT Building 20.
Building 20, yeah, it was put up temporarily for 5 years, and it stayed there for 40 because people just loved it, and
everything came out of that building. Yeah, because it's your own flexibility of space. Like if you're going to build software or design, your environment needs to be able to be designed and developed in the same way that you're making something. Once you're set into a super solid environment, it's like, okay, now I'm in this perfectly finished office where everybody has assigned seats. You know, I had to design a new office when we got acquired, and so I designed it so that everything was modular. And of course, the minute we got all of our assigned seats, we like messed with it, and we rearranged it like every 2 or 3 weeks and stuff.
I think there's an interesting story. Does anyone know who Gordon McKenzie is? He used to work for Hallmark. He wrote this fantastic book called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. It's awesome. You should totally read it. So he worked at a huge corporation where, frankly, there was tons of politics and it was hard to be creative, even though it was a creative company. But he was sort of the harebrained dude that somehow he got away with a lot of stuff. And one of the things that he got away with was he basically threatened to quit. And they were like, no, what can we do to keep you? What can we do? And he's like, fine, I want to take this team and I want to just go rogue. So he went rogue, and they gave him a specific budget to create this space for a creative team that was going to be sort of doing just wild harebrained ideas for Hallmark. And they went out and they got a space that was a bunch of cubicles, and they tore down all the cubicles, and they went out to antique fairs and they got doors, all kinds of crazy doors. So like vintage doors, you know, antique doors, modern doors, whatever. And they hung the doors from the ceiling to sort of like carve off spaces for themselves. And then they got like milk cartons for trash cans. And so he gets pulled into corporate office by the finance team. And they were like, whoa, dude, what's going on here? We're like, you can't just organize a space like this. And they start going line item by line item. They're like, doors, actually check, that's fine. We can sort of write that off.
Doors are good. Yeah,
doors are all right, we need doors. Desks, totally fine. You got these like antique crazy desks, check, that's fine. milk cans. That's why he got flagged. That's why he got pulled into corporate, was the milk cans. They were like, we have nowhere to put this. There's no line item in our traditional corporate financial structure for milk cans. He's like, but they're trash cans. And she's like, okay, we'll put that into facilities. And they were like, okay, you're clear, check, go off. So this team had built out this super creative environment. They were able to do stuff that would progress Hallmark into sort of the next version of what they needed to be, pull them out of sort of just greeting cards. They were coming up with crazy sort of like action figures, and having the ability to just have this space and be completely decoupled from what he terms as the giant hairball allowed them to really be creative. And this is sort of where I like to be a devil's advocate. Something that we struggle with at Carbon 5 is this idea of, we've had design as a competency in our company since for the last 7 years. But having design really be able to be wacky is, I think, really important. And the designers feel that way too. So I think it's, culture and environment are completely linked. Figuring out a way to have your designers really be able to frankly, go nuts is important. And we're still sort of struggling with how can the creatives have a space that feels really wacky and creative and yet still have pair programming desks and 30-inch monitors. So it's something that we're playing around with. And happily, we can play around with it, but not every corporation can. So maybe threaten to go rogue and go get some doors.
We've had a... Thank you, Ms. Jones, for the fax. That's very nice. Thank you. It's just arrived. Mail pigeons, yes, they're very reliable things. We've had a couple of questions. Excuse me, I'm old. Programmers love hackathons. Do you encourage designers to attend those events hand in hand with developers?
We have design hackathons. If you're ever in San Francisco, they're awesome. So yeah, I think it's fantastic. It's amazing the amount of designers that come. And then developers actually stick around because they find it, honestly, a little bit more entertaining than the hackathon.
Okay.
Or than
All right, I'm going to organize one in Warsaw. Who's with me? Right, good. Okay. Next, devs talks to designers and back through artifacts of the work. There it is. Daniel, you're an academic, right? You use the word artifacts. Where are you? Your best practice, ASM to PSD, and back as one language? Question mark.
So all design documentation is waste. Everything that designers make, except for design decisions, which is true design work, is waste. And in any given system, you're not going to eliminate waste completely, but you can try to minimize it. So if you can convey a design decision to your team, we used to have a horizontal navigation, but we need to go vertical. If I can just write a comment at the bottom of the story, and that's sufficient, great.
So you really only need this?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Sometimes the developers will come back and they'll say, well, okay, we went from this to this, so now we've got to move our two-column layout. So do you want the two-column, we used to have two-column, now we have three. Do you want them to be 50%, 50%, two-thirds? How do you want to do it? You go, I don't know, let me go to the whiteboard. So now you're stepping up the fidelity of your mock, or of your model, right? So you go to the whiteboard and you go, okay, you know what, 50-50 is going to make sense, so you do that. And then the developer says, great, thank you. They come back, they say, oh, actually, when we do this, I need pixel precision. I need to really know what's going on. Okay, so now you step up the fidelity to a wireframe in Axure, or Balsamic, or Illustrator, or whatever. And then sometimes if that's not sufficient, you go into the high fidelity, Photoshop shiny comp that looks like the final thing. But by starting with the least amount, the minimum viable deliverable is what we call it. If you start with the minimum viable deliverable and then ratchet it up, rather than investing all this time in a high fidelity comp that's expensive and boring, honestly, once the design decisions have been made, you're both avoiding training the client to think that all design must be delivered the very expensive way, and you're freeing designers to do the interesting work and kind of removing the scut work as much as possible.
This kind of thinking actually goes back some years to when clients had different expectations of designers. When designers were people who showed up with boards with beautifully printed out things, and you had to present 20 comps, and then the client would say, well, I don't know, I think blue, I don't like blue.
The worst thing for designers in that regard, for digital product designers, is the TV show Mad Men. Yeah. Because we have a whole generation of people who they're like, oh yeah, I know what design is, I saw it on Mad Men.
That's right, yeah, comps, that's right, yeah. I mean, this is actually quite an interesting point. Design is decisions, right? Design is not beautiful things on paper.
It can be, but the fundamental unit of work for design,
but the fundamental
unit is the design decision.
Yeah, that's very cool. I like that. Okay, now No, there's no more questions, so we're just gonna go home and drink beer. No, okay. Now, for those of you who do not have, if we can have a microphone, who do not have Twitter accounts.
I have a question to designers mostly. What are the most common and severe sins of the developers who come by and do different stuff to your designs and so on? So, what's you personally take the most severe sin from the developer? So what you don't like in what developers
like
do
real
to you?
Like personality blowouts? Is this sort of thing you're talking about, or?
Sometimes.
Yeah. How do you handle those things? Because
yeah, but also what's like sometimes developers tend to like challenge every designer decisions. There are some developers who just like mindlessly implementing whatever designer does, and then it comes out not so good. So what are the most severe sins you've seen?
So I like developers and really respect developers. I think the worst thing that I see is developers bike shedding, getting into an argument about which language and which framework and all that is the best. Now, on some cases, that's a really good thing. So what we've done instead, somebody says, I want to try out this new framework, right? So I say, great, let's do a tiny little app using that. Let's do it in 2 days, and let's see, is it easy to develop in? Do you want to support it for the next 3 years? Did you have a good time working with it? You could find the limitations, right? So usually if it's a new programming language or a new framework, like they find all the edge cases really fast because they're doing a project really fast. And then they have an opinion, right? They're like, well, we use this thing and it was really cool looking, but it actually sucks. Or we love this thing and we're gonna run meetup groups about it now and like make our office the hub of this new programming language, right? And then I also, like the other thing that happens is they'll be like, well, I'm gonna make a whole new framework for this thing, right? And I say, well, isn't there like a piece of code out there that already does that? And they say, oh no, but it's PHP, so we don't wanna look at it. You know, and I say, that's great. You can make a new thing. How long will it take you? I'm like, oh, 3 months, no big deal. Or 2 weeks, or 2 days, right? So I multiply it by 4 in my head, and I say, okay. So you do that, that's fine with me. Now, do you want to support that for the next 5 years, right? Even after you're gone, let's say you make it open source, because then you're going to have to support it forever. Or, you know, and then I say, is that really the case? And if they say yes, I say, great. Do it. And we've gotten some amazing open source projects out of that, like, you know, Esri Leaflet, which is a way to, anyway, it's a long story. But some of the other things, they're like, no, there's already this piece of code that's been written. We'll just use it. It's done. It's got documentation. It's stable. It's been around for 5 years. That's fine, right? And then we say, oh, if we want to refactor it later and change it, we can. But you don't have to worry about this thing, this thing, this thing, and this thing. So it's always about this thing of, I find developers like, just because they can do a thing doesn't mean it's the best use of their time, and you don't want people weighed down with supporting all of these tiny little things, because it makes everybody really, it makes the developer themselves really annoyed, because you get all these like support requests all the time for something that you hadn't built.
Wojtek, 1 second, you were laughing at this.
No, I was just smiling with admiration, right? I've seen scenes like this, and yes, indeed, developers would love to build new things, right? Which supports something like 80% of the use case, and then they'll think about the rest later, while they might be some really good piece of code doing the job perfectly already.
John?
I've heard open source software described, you know, there's free as in freedom and free as in beer. And people say, no, it's not free as in beer, it's free as in puppies. Because you have to, they're free, you can take them, but you have to take care of them now. Yeah. And starting those open source projects
and they grow.
Yeah.
Sometimes they grow really, really large. So we had a few people do some really, really popular open source projects, and it's almost their entire full-time job at this point. So this guy came up to me, he's like, I made this thing, and there's, you know, 1,000 pull requests, crap, you know. I'm like, well, you did a great thing. You know, now we need to teach you how to manage open source development community so that you don't have to spend 80% of your time working on this. And he's like, well, I really like it. I'm like, well, you don't have time to do your regular job, you know?
I mean, the option there is to spin it off as its own product, its own company. And at my last company, we had exactly this problem. We had built as just kind of there's this newfangled technology called Ruby on Rails, and we wanted to kick the tires and see if it was real, and something that we could, with a good conscience, go to clients and charge them a lot of money to build software against us. So we did our own internal product management system in Rails, and it turned out it was great, and our clients started using it. And when they disengaged, they said, that was great, can I keep my account? Because this has really changed the way I work, I love it. So pretty soon thereafter, we said, okay, let's just make this free for anyone to use.
How much collaboration between designers and developers was the development of this tool?
At the time, there were no designers in the company, so zero. But
was this a good thing or a bad thing?
Was it a good
Or was
thing?
it just a thing and it didn't really matter because it just needed to be functional?
Well, design was not the biggest problem. So it was sufficient, it was functional, it was great. But the problem was, now that it went out to the world and everybody was using it, it got very popular, there was no revenue stream to support it. So people would start hitting bugs and they'd submit bug requests, and we didn't have resources to support that. So we finally made the decision to productize it and say, look, it's going to cost $20 a month or whatever it is, but we'll build a real team and treat it like a real product and spin it off. And it's been very successful that way, and it's serving both the business and the users better now.
Any more questions? We've got 7 minutes.
I don't know if this would answer your question at all. In terms of kind of the developers changing design, was that partly your question?
Sometimes they do this.
Right. So I think that, this is something, I am a developer, and, oftentimes you get a design and you implement it. What we found is that two things. One, because we minimize the amount of deliverables for designs at Carbon 5, the deliverable that you get, if you get one and it is a comp, or you maybe get a kit of parts, it's like, iconography or, visual language that you're going to use. You implement it, and yes, it's not going to look like what the designer wants, and so they sit down with the developer and actually go through all of the screens throughout the entire product, whether it's mobile or, on a web. So that is sort of the way in which we've kind of managed it, and that's like the closest collaboration that ends up being the most efficient. But it does require developers that are okay sitting down for literally, what amounts to probably 3 hours with the designer and changing CSS and checking it straight in, that sort of thing.
Development tools is growing and getting better and better and better. And right now I feel, especially with this flat design, that the development process sometimes is faster than design process. You mentioned it yesterday in your speech. And the question is, do you try to work like that there is a developer on the left side and the designer on the right side, they're working with the same thing, because it's way much faster to fix something in CSS instead of doing this in Photoshop?
Well, what we found is that our team is just designer developers. Like they're blurring, right? So like our original design team was print designers. So they did printing press work and typesetting and typography, that sort of thing. And so then they took that to the web and they taught themselves HTML and CSS, and then JavaScript, and then Ruby, and then it just keeps going. So we've got the design team that's going this way towards complexity and development, and then we've got the developers that are all picking up, starting with Bootstrap and then going all the way down. And then you've got people that are like, hey, look, I found Interface Builder, in iOS development, and I don't have to write any code. I just, and then sketch it out and then connect everything. And then, and at that point, like, people aren't really dividing themselves too much. Like, if it's a person who's traditionally been a developer, they might ask somebody who's traditionally been a designer what they think about it. But it's blurring so much that, our head design managers at this point better at development than design, and he just kind of, he couldn't help it, right? Because after a while, when I first started as UX designer, I was doing stuff in Visio, right? I was just drawing diagrams and wireframes. But now, we do a lot of everything through whiteboard, and then it goes directly to, here's a full working mock-up that's coded, because it's so fast.
You touched on a point that we're probably going to wrap up with, which is kind of pointing our way towards the future, and we do need to be wrapping this up. You just said they taught themselves A, B, C, and D. So many people teach themselves stuff simply because they need it now, and we are inventing this insane world as we're going along. Where does if we were to design, or maybe put down a few pointers to someone who was designing a course for young folk to be actually taking on the next round of projects, what would be some of the pointers specifically on the subject that we've been talking about?
Well, I think if you're a developer, just showing somebody Bootstrap, like, a really fast speed through video of here's how to set up Bootstrap so that you have a minimum amount of design. Like I see a lot of developers come up with a really interesting project, like they'll make like a little desktop app or a widget or a Chrome plugin or something like that, and then they'll make this really ridiculously bad looking site just because they've never done front-end design before, and then you throw Bootstrap at them and they're like, oh cool, da-da-da, you know, and then it's really fast, right? And then the opposite.
So speed, yeah?
Speed is just, here's a tool that's already been written that allows you to have something that looks good, right?
Guys?
And yeah.
Other points?
Yeah.
So quickly digestible education, right? Yeah?
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate on that point. I think that from sort of the development side, Bootstrap is amazing. Providing, if you do have design, providing your developers with the kit of parts, you know, using something like Icomoon to come up with a font set that actually gives you all the iconography that you would need for an interface, hugely advantageous. And then from the design side, there's so many designers that I know right now that are just, you know, online courses that you can take to learn a lot more about JavaScript, HTML, CSS. The amount that interfaces are changing towards more dynamic elements. And when I say that, I mean like animations, you know, whatever it is, if we're talking about mobile, like swipe events, understanding sort of both from kind of the development and the design side, you know, what is a theory of design and reading up on that. I think like, you know, Google Material Design is something that's great to look into. You know, the Apple design specs that they have come out with. I think these are good things to just sort of like read about and understand from both sides of the spectrum.
I think it's really important. You said, you framed the question in terms of teaching yourself, but it's really important to learn with others and teach others and learn from others. So if you're trying to learn these things, the two things I usually recommend to people are find a project, like have something that you're building and owning. It can be a to-do list, it doesn't matter. But if it's something that you're starting to build, you're going to find problems you didn't know you'd find, and you won't be able to answer them. And the second thing is go find people to help you. So go to hackathons, go to meetups, find a pair, find somebody who's much more literate in development, and they'll help you out, and you'll end up helping them back in design, or vice versa. Hackathons are really great for that. It's a really great opportunity to work with new people and also try on a new role. If you're in marketing but you really want to do design, you probably can't do that in your day job. But if you go to a hackathon, you can do that for a weekend, and it becomes a great way to figure out, like, I love this, I want to do it, or I thought I'd like it, but you know what, I really don't want to spend all day in Photoshop.
Wojtek,
I think all was said already.
yeah. Okay.
I have one last point,
right.
annoyingly enough.
I go on.
What got me into development was people kept sending me like little links. They'd be like, hey, look, you can do a one-click install of like a forum software, you know, where I didn't have to write any code and it was this crappy PHP thing, you know, and then later someone's like, hey, do iPhone development, here's a zip file of iPhone code, and I just edit it. And it was always about, here's something, it's really simple, edit it. And then later on, if I want to do more iPhone development, I got a recipe book where it wasn't about learning everything from scratch. It was, here's a way to use the accelerometer. Here's a button. Here's a, you know, so in about 20 minutes, you'd get a fully fledged project that you could like show off. And that really helped because I got like that quick win each time.
So personal relationships, kind of a mentoring kind of relationship both ways.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've come a full circle from the days of master and apprentice. Everything changes, everything stays the same. And on that note, I think we're going to have to finish up. Courtney Hemphill, Amber Case, Jonathan Berger, and Wojtek Berger. Thank you very much.